Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at a nice little defense against the pawn opening of d4 from white, and that's the Grunfeld defense. Let's go ahead and get into it. It starts with pawn to d4, black knight to f6, development move, aiming at the center. White continuing with his pawns to c4, trying to gain center control. Black playing pawn to g6, getting ready to fianchetto his bishop to the g7 square. White playing knight to c3, development move, and at the same time putting pressure on the center. And from here, black's going to play pawn to d5. And this is the situation we're going to look at throughout this video. And this is the Grunfeld defense. And white has a few options here. And the first one we're going to look at is the main line, and that's the exchange variation. And one of the key things that you'll look at throughout the Grunfeld defense is white really has to pay a lot of attention to defending the center. Black is going to play a hypermodern defense, meaning that he's going to give up center control to white, and white's going to control the center with his pawns. Black's not going to try to attack the center with his pawns. Instead, he's going to try to attack the center with all his minor pieces and major pieces aimed at the center of the board. So he's going to give up the center to white with his pawns, and in exchange he's going to attack the center. So white's going to have to be on the defense and hold on. In this case, it's going to be the d4 pawn, and we'll look at that here in a minute. But white's going to have to play very defensively to try to hold on to the center that black's going to give white in the beginning. And then we'll look at a few variations where white can actually avoid the main line and get into more aggressive lines if he doesn't like to play a defensive style from white. So we'll go ahead and continue and first look at the main line, and that's with white taking on d5 with his pawn, and black's going to recapture with his knight. And white's going to bring his pawn down to e4, attacking this knight on d4, forcing it to move, and at the same time getting a nice square for his pawn on e4. White has very good center control with his pawns. As you can see, black does not. Black's going to continue to take up this knight on c3, and white's going to take with his pawn on c3. As you can already tell, black has no pieces really aimed at the center besides his queen on d8, aimed at this d4 square. This d4 square is going to be a very important square that we'll see. But as you can see, black's already conceded the center of the board. He's not even trying right now to gain control of the center with his pawns. Instead, he's going to try to use his minor pieces. And he's going to start out with his bishop to g7, fianchetto his bishop to g7 square. And from here, white's going to bring his bishop to c4. Now, a few times you will see white bring his knight to f3, but a lot of times I think this is the wrong move. Kasparov did play this, and so it's really hard to say that it's the incorrect play if he can play it, but I don't play like Kasparov. He's a little better than I am. And from here, I think after bishop to g4, pinning this knight down, that's just too much pressure, I think, added on the center. I think white's going to play a much better game if he just brings his bishop to the c4 square. And that is the main line, so we're going to just continue with bishop to c4, adding pressure on the center. And from here, black's going to counter kingside. This bishop here attacking this f7 square is a very key weakness for black, and so black's going to go ahead and put his king in safety, castling kingside. And from here, white's going to bring his knight to e2, and this is a much safer square. Both his knight on f3 and knight on e2 are both going to defend this pawn on d4, which is what we need the knight to do. But now if we bring our bishop to g4, we can no longer pin this knight down to the queen. The white pawn can just come to f3, so you're not going to see the bishop come out and do that. Instead, you'll see that black play a move more common of pawn to c5, and what this does is adds a lot of pressure to this d4 square. As you can see, we've already started to put a lot of pressure on this pawn here on d4. We have our bishop, we have our pawn, and we have our queen all attacking this pawn on d4. Now from here, play continues with white castling. And then black's going to develop his knight to c6, and at the same time putting another attacker on this d4 pawn. From here you may see play continue with bishop to e3, adding another defender on the d4 pawn. And from here the queen's going to come to c7, and what this does, if you've seen some of the other videos, it indirectly attacks this bishop on c4. So from here a lot of times you'll see white bring his his rook to c1. He's indirectly defending this bishop on c4. Once these pawns are exchanged, the rook now is going to defend this bishop on c4. So that's why you see those moves in the main line. And from here you'll see rook to d8, putting even more pressure on this pawn. And from here you may even see white continue to add pressure on the d4 pawn by bringing his rook on f1 to d1. And this is the main variation. You will see a few variations in the exchange. Variation that we talked about at the very beginning when the pawn takes on d5. And as you can tell, black does not have center control, but all his pieces are aiming at the center, trying to undermine white's center control of the pawns. And white's going to have to play very smart and very defensively to hold on to this advantage. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few other variations that you will see often. We'll go ahead and get into again d4, Grunfeld defense. And after d4, white does not have to capture here. One of the more common moves that you will see is bishop to f4. And this is a move that I like myself. It keeps white playing an aggressive game, and at the same time it still adds a lot of pressure to the center. If black's going to let you take the center, you might as well take it and then just play accordingly, depending on how you want the game to go. So from here, you'll see black castle after he fianchettos his bishop to g7. And from here, there's a few moves, but I like white playing pawn to e3, getting ready for his bishop to come into the game, defending this pawn on c4. Now from here, a lot of times you'll see pawn to c5, but you may not see pawn to c5 right away, and it's very interesting how it looks. A lot of players look at this as the Grunfeld gambit. I like to look at it as just a pawn loss. If you see players after pawn to e3 castle kingside before they play c5, then from here after the exchange, white's going to be up a pawn. Now it's called a gambit, but I actually just think that white's better and he's up in material. And it'll look like this. After pawn takes on d5 and knight takes and the white knight takes and the queen takes, then the bishop can take on c7. And this is why more times than not you'll see this pawn to c5 instead of castling kingside first. So if you do see castle on the queenside first, it is the Grunfeld gambit. But if you're playing white and you do see this, just go ahead and take the gambit and go ahead and take this pawn on c7. But more times than not, you're going to see the player play his pawn to c5 first. And you'll do this because from here you'll see pawn takes on on c5. And from here the queen's going to come to a5 from queen. He's pinning down this knight. The knight can't go anywhere. He's going to get his queen involved on this c5 pawn after he captures. So that's one thing you will see. Let's go ahead and take a look at one other example that you may see after here. The last example we're going to look at is the Russian variation, and it's probably the most aggressive from white. So if you're playing white and you do see the Grunfeld defense and you still want to keep that aggressive nature in you, then I suggest the Russian variation because it is very aggressive from white. And it gets the queen involved early, and therefore you're going to be putting a lot of pressure on black. And it continues with the moves knight to f3. Instead of capturing at the beginning or trying to gain center control with your bishop, you're instead going to bring your knight to f3. If he brings his bishop into the act, your knight's not going to be pinned down, so more times than not you're not going to see the bishop come out right away. Instead, more times than not, you'll see the bishop fianchetto to g7, and from here the queen can now come to b3. And this is the aggressive move that we're talking about here. We're pretty much forcing black to capture on c4, and after he captures and we recapture with our queen on c4, you can already tell that we don't quite have the same presence in the middle with our pawns as we did in the exchange variation, but at the same time we do still have a very good center control. We have good center control with our knights, we have a good pawn placed on d4, and our queen's very active. Now, a lot of times black will try to chase our queen around, but this is why this is the more aggressive variation. So for those white players that are aggressive, keep in mind this is an option for you if you want to avoid the exchange variation or bring your bishop to f4, which is very popular and I like. So this is the Grunfeld defense. Take a look at it, play around with it, let me know what you think. Everyone, thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe. If you haven't checked out the website, please do, www.thechesswebsite.com. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys next video. Thanks for watching, everybody.